as I understand it, you see the Jewish community, the Messianic community generally embracing the Torah, not as something that's absolutely binding in some sense that would be legalistic, as Paul describes Judaizers, for example, but you don't see those as being as much of a calling or a path for Gentile believers. Is that right?
That's right. I think what you see in the New Covenant scriptures is very much an assumption that the Jewish pattern of life continues. You see this very much of Paul in Acts chapter 21. And the whole idea that Paul was in sin because he had ethnic pride and refused to listen to the prophet and went to Jerusalem anyway, and then he really backslid and did that sacrifice is such a non-first century understanding of what Paul was about. But what you see in the New Testament is when the New Testament presents the place of law, and it presents it very positively, it always presents these universal dimensions. You see it in the Sermon on the Mount. You see it in 1 Timothy 1, where Paul gives he gives the categories of basic moral law, and then he says, and whatever else is against the gospel that I preach in 1 Timothy 1. So you never see anything in the New Testament exhorting Gentiles to responsibility to a Jewish pattern of life, that dimension of law. But on the other hand, you don't see it precluded. So you see in Romans chapter 14, you can be convinced in conscience to participate. I don't think he's saying that to Jews in the context of Romans. But when he gets to Colossians and Galatians, and people are laying this on people to be responsible for a Jewish pattern of life, he blasts them to smithereens. But then he gives that little artless statement in chapter 5 when he says, if you are circumcised, you're responsible to keep the whole law. Well, wait a minute, did Paul believe that? He was circumcised. So you see that distinction comes through in the New Testament between that which is universal. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua's emphasis is on the moral. Now, he doesn't completely ignore the ritual in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, in terms of tithing and other things, and in other passages as well, he says, you should have done that, but that's not the important part. And then he goes to the moral heart of things.
Well, Dan, one extreme, at least in my opinion, that I don't think want to go to is what's sometimes called a dual covenant, where Jews have one covenant with God and Gentiles have another covenant with God. If the Noah covenant has fewer laws, the Mosaic covenant has more laws, is there some sense that Gentiles always have fewer and Jews always have more? If you take that line of thinking, do you actually get to the point where, say, Jews and Gentiles will continue to have two different covenants?
I don't think it's two different covenants. I think it's two different approaches to identity. See, Jewish identity continues in the New Covenant, and Gentiles are grafted in, but given a certain liberty. So if you go to this two covenant idea, it wreaks havoc with the interpretation of Jeremiah 31, doesn't it? Because God says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So there is no covenant made with the Gentiles since Noah. There's a covenant made with the Jews, but the new covenant enables the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, hence to bring blessing to the nations, which you see in Amos 9. So the new covenant enables Israel to fulfill its destiny, which is to bring blessing to the nations. So when Gentiles accept Yeshua, they are being joined to the Jewish people without becoming Jews. Now the question is, how is that joinedness to the Jewish people in the new covenant expressed? And it's expressed by respecting the Jewish way of life, by studying and understanding the feasts and their meaning of grace, by understanding how they come to their fullness in Yeshua, by sometimes participating in celebration with Jewish people. But there's always this tremendous liberty, because I believe that way before we got into this idea of indigeneity and missions, the New Testament is looking at the most effective form of the gospel or as being the one that can be rooted in other societies and cultures without turning them all into Israel as an ethnic people. So sure, Gentiles are required to do less with regards to Jewish patterns of life, to respect those patterns as having eschatological and deep prophetic meaning, but they're required to do more to relate to their Chinese culture or to their Japanese culture.
Yeah.
And I think one of the weaknesses of missions has been, which has been greatly addressed over the last 50 years, has been to look into those cultures and to say, what are the things here that are here by the grace of God that we should continue in our Christian walk with God? What are the practices in our culture that we keep?
There's no doubt about that. From an ecclesiological point of view, there aren't two covenants. From an eschatological point of view, there aren't, in my opinion, there aren't any necessary corollaries to the singular ecclesiology. There's nothing necessary that says God has nothing in store for Jews separate from Gentiles, because the eschatological plan that he has in place is with the nations, and the Jews as a people within that are not, there's nothing mutually exclusive.
I think that ecclesiology is the foundation of missions. If you don't get your ecclesiology right, you're forever struggling, because if Jewish people think you're living a Jewish life just for an evangelistic purpose, it's inauthentic, and they read it. But if you are living a Jewish life because it's part of what you're called to be as an ethnic people, and then so what you're really saying is, when a Gentile, and by the way, this is in Mark Kinzer's brilliant book, but that book really reflects our progress in the Roman Catholic dialogue that Mark and I have been involved in for years. It's called Searching Her Own Identity. And what he argued, and what we argued with the Catholics before Mark put it into book form, is when people become Christians, they accept the King of Israel, and they become joined to Israel by being joined to the Messianic Jews. And they're joined to the Israel even that is still in unbelief, because Messianic Jews are still part of Israel. So you draw the Venn diagram, like I have in my book, Jewish Roots, and you see that the Jewish believer is the intersection of the circle of Israel and the church at this time. Those circles will merge ultimately, but it will still preserve ethnic identities, and the Jewish ones centrally and foundationally so. But you see this idea that you have been joined to Israel. So if the nature of the church is the people from all nations who have a joined to Israel identity, then what you realize is that for the Gentiles, what is ethnically most appropriate for the gospel to be rooted in their culture, while at the same time respecting the original cultural foundation in which the gospel came. And then they have a lot of freedom in terms of how to connect to those realities, but they have to have a hard intent to connect to it.